So, like all Atlantic staff, but backstage, we talked about the Klan. We were listening to Gil Scott.
We weren't listening, but we did talk about Gil Scott Heron and the Klan.
Well, I was listening.
You were.
And you
I
walked
wasn't.
in on me listening to it.
Right on. Okay.
My first question's about the Klan.
Okay. The Klan proper.
The Klan proper, the Ku Klux Klan.
Okay.
So, actually, I think there's a subject there that's on everybody's minds right now. It's a subject of identity, of finding your past. And actually, growing up in the South, the people who I always were associated most with that need to find their past were white Southerners. So have you connected in a way to the drive that's in the news now to find a collective identity?
It's a nice first question, Van.
Yes.
Not complicated to answer at all. I think so. I think there are a lot of things to say about that. First, regarding the sort of like white person search for ancestry and identity. In part, the American story, as we are taught it in history class, is really like the white story of America. And the American origin story is really the white immigrant origin story, which is we came from the old world and we arrived here on the shores of America. And because of divine providence, we succeeded and we worked hard and, and here we are, the Horatio Alger story, right? So I think that narrative is intriguing and popular and like maybe lends or encourages white folks to delve maybe further into it, and they are aided and abetted by technology like digitized ancestry records and DNA testing that can tell you theoretically who your ancestors are. But brown people have been sort of left out of that narrative in a lot of ways, right? We're told, like, you left the old world and you're here, and like we're busy just trying to like get by in theory, right? There's not enough time to sort of relax into the American narrative and try and find our place in it. And that was actually the dynamic at my house, right? Like there was this kind of very romantic version of how my father's family came to be the Wagners of Lansing, Iowa. And my mom had arrived from Rangoon, Burma, just, a few decades before, or a decade before I was born. And nothing was ever really said about
Iowa and Burma,
very far apart. So yeah, I mean, I guess to get to your question about whether origins tend to be the province of white folks, right? The exploration of origins, yeah, I do think that's the case. But I tried to upend that by going into origins on both sides of my family, brown and white.
I like starting with the last question.
Yeah, okay.
But going back to the beginning of Futureface, you're talking about an Ancestor Quest. You call it an Ancestor Quest.
Yeah.
What did you learn in your Ancestor Quest? And how is it applicable to what you know today and to the room today? Maybe?
So the Ancestor Quest, it's interesting because this is a hard question to answer on some level because I think it's really important to know the true history behind your family, right? Like I think it is imperative to understand the sins that the sins of the past, the transgressions, the flawed people that all of our forefathers and foremothers inevitably were, right? Like that's just, it's important as humans, as Americans, as members of a democracy to have some baggage and for stories to have weight, to be real. But at the same time, as important as that information is and that truth is, I think we're really preoccupied with the past and the future, especially in this country, right? But we don't embrace the present, I think, as much as we should. And what I learned in the book was, I had this kind of weightless Futureface existence, and I wanted to find meaning and identity and community by looking backwards. And what I realized, spoiler alert, is that the community that we have is now. You guys, planet Earth, Washington, D.C., New York City, whoever you find that is like-minded, that makes your heart sing, that challenges your brain, that feels like family, I mean, those are your people. And as cliched as that sounds, I feel like we don't invest in the present. And that's fundamentally what I learned in the journey of the book.
And the title comes from, what is it, Time Magazine?
Time Magazine.
Time Magazine, this is the future of America, right?
It ain't the Atlantic, let me tell you. Much respect to any Time Magazine journalists out there. owned by the Meredith Corporation. So Time magazine in 1993 had a cover that was I know that I see my high school friends right here. Do you guys remember this? Or maybe you don't because you weren't like a mixed race child that was obsessed with it. But it was this cover that was a composite image of all of the races that would be dominant in the next like 20 or 30 years in America. And it was this,
20 or 30
yeah,
years.
I mean, I'm not saying how old I am, but I remember this, and I remember thinking, oh my God, I look like this cover of this magazine. I am the future face of America. And that was like hugely validating. It was the first time I had seen anything that vaguely resembled me racially and was championed as a positive, exciting new thing. And for a while, I mean, I would say most of my early 20s, I loved that idea. I loved that I was this inscrutable, mixed-raced, sort of hapa, toucan, like, who knew what she was? I just was talking with Gayle King at CBS, my home away from home, and Gayle said, yeah, when I first saw you on TV, I had to get up really close to the television because I was like, is her hair kinky? Is she black? Is she Puerto Rican? What is she? And you know, and there is something freeing about being everything and nothing. But as I got older, I realized, you know, I wanted to know more about my racial composite. I wanted to know what it meant to be Burmese. I wanted to know who those random Burmese people were that brought me into existence, and those Irish, Luxembourgian Europeans who brought me into existence. And so the weightlessness of being just simply Futureface became untenable.
Your journey kind of mirrors, I guess, how we think about that cover now. Now we look at it, it's clearly silly.
Yeah.
Like the cover is just, oh, no way this actually is going to happen. It's been 30
I mean,
years
it might,
already.
Van. It might. Who knows? I mean, although in this particular moment, it's like, are you kidding me?
Are you kidding me?
It feels like we're getting further from that reality than closer. But I think another part of it was, and this is very much to your point, we thought race could be this thing that you just like kind of like threw around and tossed at the wall and did, like I was conceiving of this kind of brown post-racial future where the history of blood and plunder that our colleague Ta-Nehisi Coates at The Atlantic writes so beautifully about, like that somehow you could be free of that by just being some new avatar from the future. But of course, no future is free of the past, and race can never really be free of the history of race.
You talk about blood.
Yeah.
Well, that sort of mirrors here because you have blood, this idea that you're going to just have all this mixing of blood and DNA. You're going to have a future race. But now we're realizing that race, ethnicity, culture, what it means to be American are so much more than just who your parents are, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's this moment in I'll call it, I was like 25. The 20s are so hazy. But for good reason, you know, I lived them well. I was in a cafe. I was at this place called Grey Dogs Coffee in New York, which is like this kind of quasi NYU coffee shop. And this guy with this like super cleft chin, he looked like he was from a soap opera, came up to me. I was wearing a one feather earring because that was like a cool thing to do, I guess, in the early 2000s. And he, you remember the story, I love you. And he came up to me and he I was just trying to order coffee and he said, "What's your blood?" And I was like, "Oh, negative," like so sassy, like you're such an asshole, like what a douche. But, and the idea that some fundamental identity is in your blood is why I went back to Burma, for example. And it's why I went to Luxembourg, because I had this feeling as I was writing this book that like I would go and put foot to ground in Rangoon, and I would step on the ground in Esch, Luxembourg, and I would feel the vibrations of my forefathers, and I would have this revelatory experience where I could finally have this lightning bolt of like belonging, right? That the hemoglobin in my blood would, you know, finally start zinging, or whatever hemoglobin does. It's a clotting function, but you know, that part of the blood is a fallacy. I mean, that narrative of, I think, blood identity is a fallacy.
Yeah, my favorite part of the book is that it's an everyman story, right? Just like everybody else, you go on this Ancestor Quest and find out that you might be Jewish.
Yeah.
Like everybody else.
Yeah. We're all part of the
we're all
tribe.
part of
It's true. It's true.
But actually, the part there that I think you identify as the more important thing is why people in your family may be upset or unsettled by the possibility.
Yeah. I was I was paddleboarding. That's like the worst part of this whole story is that I was paddleboarding. I was paddleboarding on a lake in Wisconsin, and I had been sort of like, I was engaged in this family sort of research project, and my cousin Carl blurted out to me while we were on paddleboards, like, well, you know, our great-grandfather spoke Yiddish, right? And I was like, wait a second. My dad, I mean, in every photo of my father from his school age years, he's in like, he's surrounded by nuns and priests. I mean, they went to church every Sunday. They said their prayers every night. I mean, Roman Catholicism was the focal point of my father's upbringing in rural Iowa. And the suggestion that somehow we were Jewish was like, I mean, I hate to use the phrase drop the mic because it's so cliched, but I can't think of anything as abrupt. It was like a record scratch. Like, how in hell could we be Jewish? I, of course, was like, oh my God, I hope we're Jewish. But it was a repudiation of the cultural history that had been handed down and like this sort of gauzy narrative about life in Iowa, the idea that we would have lied completely, forsaken our roots, and were members of a completely different tribe. I mean, I obviously wanted to follow that to the ends of the earth to try and prove its veracity.
Why'd you want it to be true?
I think because Judaism, and okay, I won't say it. It is a tribe. I mean, like, to be Jewish is to belong to one of the great communities of the world. And that was so intoxicating to me. I loved the idea that the clan that we were actually a part of was a mystery, and that I would be the one to uncover this belonging, this union that nobody else had been able to uncover, and that it was powerful and irrefutable in a way that other parts of my identity didn't seem to be.
So the reason I asked is because Iowa, to me, seems like the most white bread place on earth, right?
Yeah.
Like super white.
Vann, you're not incorrect.
Super white. But yet,
Steve King is from Iowa.
Right. Wow.
Just a reminder.
Just
but there
a
are
reminder.
Iowa progressives
Yes.
like my father and his family.
But the Iowan story, even the Iowa white story, is still a story about how you become white. Mm-hmm. And you have mixed up with indigenous Americans and all this like competing, dueling, really interesting and spicy history.
Yeah.
So, like, what is it like to uncover that?
I will say, of all of the pieces of my family history that I uncovered, I think the Iowa history was the one that broke my heart and also made me that moved me the most, which is to say, so my dad had many stories about growing up in Iowa. And one of the things he said in the course of telling me about the small town with the butcher and the fishmonger, he said, there were no people of color in my town. There was just one black dry cleaner. He was a really great guy. And I remember thinking, okay, well, anytime like a white person is like, there are no people of color, just that nice black guy, it's like, it's a little suspect. Like, what actually happened there? And I began doing the research on Lansing, Iowa, which is in Alameda County. And I found out, this is all in the book, that the people who were there before my father's people got there were people of color. They were the Winnebago, the Ho-Chunk Nation, the people of the Great Big Voice. And through genocide and decimation and war and federal policy, they were kicked off the land. And literally, like 5 years later, my people moved in. And what moved me so much about this information was we had always begun our family story in 1865. That's basically where the Wagner family story began. But of course, what's that?
That's a fun place.
Right, exactly. But when
mine starts too.
Yeah, right. It began when my great grandfather arrived. Right, it was actually 1871. Sorry, but yes, 1865 was an interesting year. And it occurred to me that for the first time, the Wagner family story actually shouldn't and would not start at that year, but start in the decades and maybe in the century prior. And that our family story wouldn't start when the white people started like building their houses, but in fact, it would start with the people who first had the land. And that became like, I was so sad that for so long we had forgotten who had been there first. But then I felt really empowered, especially because I just had a baby 9 months ago. I thought, you know what? My child, Sai, when I tell him the story of our family, it's going to begin with the Winnebago. And I'm going to tell him, this is who we got our land from, and this is what we did with it. And that was really important to me.
It's a good time for me to be a nerd and give you all my favorite quotes. From
I like the nerd time.
It's clearly marked up and got all my Post-it notes here.
Thank you for reading it, Vann.
Yes. This is the show that I read it. You say on page 68, paragraph 1, these seismic developments hit my backyard. Trace your ancestry and you end up charting the course of global struggle. Who we are is a product of battles fought long before us. The winners and losers from centuries ago determine our very existence, as well as a not incidental part of our day-to-day fate. So you went looking for your ancestors, and what you found, I think, and what you find if you read Futureface, is a world history.
You do.
Right.
I mean, one of the reasons I think genealogy is so attractive is because we think of history in the abstract, but when your family story starts intersecting with historical events, it takes on a grandeur and a weight and a narrative fantasy that we wouldn't previously be able to imagine. For example, I was doing research on my great-grandfather in Burma, and he had been involved in agrarian finance, which is not the sexiest topic to research. But in the course of researching what he did and how he was involved in the collapse of the Burmese economy, I read about the opening of the Suez Canal. And the opening of the Suez Canal opened up shipping lanes to Northern Europe and basically drove rice production in Burma. And it was amazing for me to think about this thing, the Suez Canal, which I had never even thought of particularly. I had no feelings about the Suez Canal, like many of us in this room. And yet, the opening of the Suez Canal set in motion a chain of events that would lead to my grandfather's role in helping collapse the Burmese economy, but also play a part in a foundational part of our family history. And that is, it's overwhelming in a lot of ways, right? But it's also important to remember that history is not, of course, just facts and figures, but it's people and movements and decisions that have real world effects.
Let's talk more about your grandfather.
Yes, let's.
Well, you go into, in the beginning of the book, I guess, you are embracing an identity as a person of color. Mm-hmm. You have a clear line drawn as to who is oppressed, who's not, who is on the right side of history, who's not, right? Then you go into your history of your family in Burma and mm-hmm. how they were actually the elite ethnic group and class in the country. And so what's that do to you and your sense of where you are in the world and the global struggle?
So especially at this moment where in America we see xenophobia and nationalism, and it is largely the province of white conservative voters, it was eye-opening for me to do the research into the brown half of my family. And what I realized is Burma has its own virulent strain of nationalism that's actually it's evident today in the genocide of the Rohingya Muslim minority in Burma. And a lot of people have seen that, which for those of you who don't know, it's 500,000 Rohingya have been killed. Millions have left the country. They've been landless and stateless for decades. They are among the world's most persecuted people, and they are part of the Burmese citizenry. And a lot of people have looked at this genocide and they've said, well, how could Buddhists do this? How could the Burmese, those gentle, kind Buddhists, be doing this? And the truth is, those Burmese are very strident, violent nationalists in a lot of cases. And these ethnic tensions have been going on forever. And I realized in the course of my research, my family harbored a lot of the same elite nationalism that is prevalent in Burma today. I mean, we in the West are horrified by the images of the Rohingya, but in Burma, the Burmese, the Bamot Burmese, which is the dominant ethnic group, they're fine with it. I mean, it polls very well. And Aung San Suu Kyi, who is the Nobel laureate, also a fraud in my book, who has basically turned a blind eye towards all of this, she's her lack of interest in doing anything about this dovetails with the interests of her Burmese voters. I mean, so the bigger picture though, Vann, to your question is, I had assumed that cresting nationalism and xenophobia and tribalism was a kind of white American thing. And as I researched more into my family history, I realized, and I say this in the book, my people could have been the ones wearing the Make Burma Great Again trucker hats, and that is something to be ashamed of, and that's something to try and reconcile, but it is also cause for a certain amount of perspective. I don't know if I'm going to say empathy, but it does inform what's happening right now, right? Like, we think that we leave the mistakes of the old world behind. We think that they're relegated to certain parts of the West. And I think also, brown immigrants are often seen as the sort of virtuous new arrivals on American shores, but they have their own bigotries and racisms and, terrible tendencies themselves. And part of becoming a fully formed person and an honest broker in this democracy is to recognize those shortcomings on both sides, no matter what the skin color is.
Yeah, I was going to say, when you chronicle your family's flight from Burma, the buildup of events is so eerily similar in some ways. You have an economic collapse. You have all these different ethnic groups vying for dominance. You have the presence of white colonialism. You have all these things. And so what you just said, you had maybe not empathy, but special insight.
Special insight.
But,
yeah. I think the problem is when we don't recognize it, that it keeps happening, right? Mm-hmm. And this is something that my book editor, Chris Jackson, and I kept talking about. It was like the pattern is so similar. It just keeps happening over and over and over again. And until we realize that not only does it happen here, right? I don't think we've still acknowledged what's happening here in America, but that it has happened elsewhere in the world, and that we bring these patterns of behavior with us and these same sort of nationalistic, violent impulses. Until you acknowledge that it happens, I don't think much can be done. And so this is maybe the first pass at that.
You start off thinking that your two parents' ancestries and stories are so dissimilar, but I think you end up in a place where you see just how common they are, right?
Yeah, I don't mean to wax too romantic about this, but
yeah, it's like kumbaya, right?
I did get really very kumbaya towards the end of the book. But I think we tend to think along nationalist lines, and there is a necessity to doing that, but also a danger. And we are human beings with impulses and flaws. And the DNA testing really brought this home, and we can talk about that if you want. But what I came away with, we can talk about that if you'd like, hint, hint, man. What I came away with was this idea that we are in America for a time. We don't know how long we're going to be here. America is an idea, and it is a moment. And if you look at my son's daughter's DNA, several generations hence, who knows what part of the globe is going to light up. And I think we need to remember that. And I just think when we sort of ascribe bad things or behaviors based solely on nationalism or solely on race, we forget that we're A, in this together, but B, we're not insulated. We have no insurance policy based simply on border lines and passports. America is fungible, and to make a better country, we have to reconcile that.
So let's talk about DNA tests.
Let's talk about DNA tests.
I've never done it, and I probably
don't.
I will never do it. And what's it like to make the decision, and what'd you learn?
So I tried to be really thorough. I put on my journalist hat and I said, I'm going to go all over the world. I'm going to talk to every living relative. I'm going to talk to archivists and genealogists and online chat rooms, and I'm going to take every DNA-based ancestry test there is and make everyone in my family take every DNA-based ancestry test that there is. Because science is going to have the definitive word. Well, guess what? Science did not have the definitive word. Science was all over the fucking place, including, here's what I'll say. The science, some of these tests are better than others. I'm not endorsing any of them. One of them told me I was 15% Scandinavian. One said I was 0% Scandinavian. That's maybe a big deal if you care about being Scandinavian or take ethnicity seriously. I had enough of a kind of comedic approach to all of this that I was like, well, that's just weird. But for a minute, I was like, maybe we should celebrate St. Lucia Day. Maybe that's why I'm so tall, and that's why I like cold weather. I mean, you start making all these justifications by some random spit test. As I got into the science, it's very questionable depending on what your DNA actually is. They'll have better sort of reference data or worse. Most of that is driven by the market, depending on who you are and where your people are from. So there was a whole science part of the DNA testing that made me think, that soured me on the DNA test. But then there was a whole cultural, sociological, anthropological sort of aspect to it that really soured me on it, which was, is it a good idea right now to be breaking ourselves up into fractional racial percentages? I don't know, seems like maybe not a good time to be doing that, in part because it reinforces the idea that we are different from one another, right? And it also offers some scientific validation around the notion of race, which is, if you talk to most geneticists, race doesn't exist as a genetic principle. Now this is being debated, but generally speaking, doubling down on the idea that we are racially different from one another and that we are unlike one another in these fractal mathematics doesn't seem to be the thing that we need to be doing right now, especially because the DNA tests offer a kind of easy way to pretend you care about your past. The way to care about your past and the way to learn the truth about your people is actually to do the work of genealogy. I mean, to find out who they actually were. The rest of it, finding out that you're 10% Norwegian or 15%, Mongolian, first of all, maybe a fallacy, but second of all, is just sort of so that you can say that at a dinner party. That's what I realized. I mean, very few people are well, I found out I was 17% Indo-Chinese, and I've done extensive work to find out about the Indo-Chinese culture. It's more like they're having crudité and they're like, you know what, I'm Scottish. It's a casual, and I don't think that there's a lot of value in that. That's the positive. The negative side is I think people hold on to sort of fractal racial identities, and in a moment when we should be trying to come together, that is a bad thing.
There's a special valence of DNA tests for me as an African American. I don't know if you guys notice I'm black. As an African American,
you think you're black. You might be 15%.
Right. I don't want to find out I'm not.
Yeah, exactly.
But there is a special, I think, significance for people, for black folks here who are trying to find ancestors that were not just lost to history, but purposefully stripped away from them.
Yep.
But I still think we're all talking about, especially people of color in this country, are all talking about a similar story of interrogating not their ancestry of color, but interrogating whiteness in a way. All of us are trying to figure out where we fit in an America that's still dominated by white culture, white people, and where we've been placed, in a sense, in castes. Mm-hmm. What have you learned about white people?
Oh, Vann. I mean, this is the fundamental question, right? How do we come together in a way that feels authentic and multivalent and multicultural and doesn't presume white culture to be sort of at the top of all of that or informing all of that, right? I think that's really hard. That's the work of today. 4 years ago, my answer to that question would be really different than it is today. But I fundamentally believe that we are getting to, this goes back to this idea of America as being fungible. I do think that we are in a moment that is not definitive in terms of where our future lies as a country. I think that what we are seeing politically and to some degree culturally is the end of something rather than the beginning of something. And I am more confident in people of color finding themselves, or not finding themselves because that's too passive, but carving out by God a place for themselves in the narrative of the American story. And that begins, with reclaiming your roots. Black Panther was so powerful for many reasons, but not least among them, it offered this alternative narrative for the Black experience, which had nothing to do with white colonialism and slavery. And that's awesome, right? Go ahead.
I said it's a good movie.
It is a good movie. And in that way, I believe that, like I said, some parts of the Ancestor Quest are valid, especially for people of color who have been denied the ancestor story that white folks have had for so long.
I imagine there's lots of stuff that did not make it into the book.
Yes.
Yes. So tell us one or two things that got left on the cutting room floor, so to speak.
Oh, man. There was so much boring stuff that didn't make it in there.
Tell me the interesting stuff.
Well, there is stuff. Some of it is like fodder for Atlantic articles, but one of the things that I got very into were the Mexican deportations of the 1930s, and the way, we really forget about a lot of stuff in this country, and the targeting of Mexican Americans around the Depression, which was unlike any, I did not know this history. We basically decided, Hoover decided that the economy was really bad, and so we were going to get all the Mexicans out of the country because they were taking American jobs. The rhetoric is shockingly familiar. And they went about it, and they literally dragged people, they went through housing rolls, any public documents, and found people with sort of Mexican sounding last names, regardless of whether or not they were actually Mexican or not, and were rounding them up in public parks. They were dragging them out of hospitals in some cases. They were taking them across the border by train and bus and dropping them off in central Mexico and leaving them there. Some of them were American citizens. Many of them were legally in America. And in so doing, the U.S. government forever changed the trajectory of certain people's lives. And this happened to, some estimates say, up to 1.5 million people. This was 100 years ago. The record keeping is abysmal, but the documents that do exist, there are people that I talked to that were part of this, whose families were part of this. Some of them made it back to America. Some of them stayed in Mexico. But what was so dramatic about that chapter is the shame they felt at having been targeted and tossed out of the country. That we had offered nothing in the way of reparations or apology, with the exception of one part of California. The people who were dragged out of hospitals and put on buses and taken during Sunday walks in the park, they were the ones that felt bad, as if they had done something to wrong America. And that, to me, was incorrigible and inexcusable. But it didn't make it into the book.
Wow.
That's how good the book is. That's how high the bar is. That is how high the bar is.
They say forgetting is the most American skill.
It is. And that's
I
part
just
of.
said that.
I'm going to start saying "they say" just when I want to quote myself. And forgetting. I don't know. It's not. I don't know that we can always remember everything all the time. But I think we have to start by beginning to remember before we can begin to forget.
You start in your preface at the border wall. This book starts at the border wall, and it uses a border, I think, really interestingly, as a way to talk about symbolic borders, how we like to make lines between people, between history and the present, between each other. I think you say that one of the most fascinating things to you is borders.
Yeah.
What have you learned about borders now, and the fact that we are talking about building a wall now?
Yeah.
Maybe not actually building a wall, but building a wall in our hearts.
It's going to be it's going to be so big and so beautiful. So on one hand, borders are completely arbitrary and meaningless, right? I walk off this stage. I walk back on. That's akin to, in some ways going from one side of the Nogales border wall to the other. And I was on this border wall in Nogales, and I'm standing there, and the border wall is insane. If you guys have a chance to go down there, forget about Mount Rushmore. This thing is like, you'll understand more about America looking at this wall than you will Mount Rushmore is nice too. Anyway, I'm standing there, and there's all their border sentries and all the rest, and it's noon, and two Mexican fruit sellers lasso a rope up, they rappel over, and they're on their way. And I thought, shit, man, that border wall is really not that effective. But also, they went from being part of the country, accepted citizens, to illegals, in just that jump over the border. And when it is as arbitrary as borders are, they command this spiritual and emotional divorce. You belong here, you don't belong here. You're part of this culture, you're part of this fabric, you're an outsider. And that act of jumping over the border, whether through citizenship or physically crossing borders, is really mysterious to me. I think because I'm an only child of two divorced parents, the loneliness of that, to go from a place where you belong to a place that isn't yours, but that you have to claim as your, in which you have to fashion a new existence. How sad and mysterious and romantic, and what happens in that process. That's really the story of American immigration. And I think we think of it in these very heated political terms, but it's really a story about humanity, and it's about loss, and it's about what you gain, and it's about starting over. It's just an incredibly, I keep using the word romantic, but that's what I really think it is.
I'm going to open up for questions in just a little bit, so start thinking. Yeah, start thinking. Get some good ones. You talked about your child and how a lot of this book is going to go into, how you teach your child about the story of what makes him. I'm thinking about the same thing right now with my 1-year-old son.
Right on.
Right. Number one, when are you starting? I need to know the actual, how to do it.
Dude, your child's 2 months older than mine. My kid's not even talking yet.
But I haven't done an Ancestor Quest yet.
Yeah, well, so how do you start talking about it?
How do you start? Well, have you learned from people how they started? And how do you reflect on how you were taught? And what would you change about what you were taught?
The first thing is, I promise myself and my child and my husband, that I am not going to rely on nostalgia and wistfulness. I think specificity is really important. Tell the specific stories about who our people were. Tell the stories about the terrible shit that they did and the beautiful shit that they did. Don't just talk generally, as my grandmother and mother did, about the wafting scent of the almond blossoms. That can be part of the story, but that shouldn't be the story. And I feel like we go back on these crutches of nostalgia way too often. I'm going to start the story in a different place. I don't have to start the story when the Wagners came to Iowa. I'm going to start when the Winnebago were kicked off the land. I don't have to start the story with the purchase of the family Dodge motor car in Rangoon, Burma. I'm going to start with the collapse of the Burmese economy. I'm going to choose a different starting point for our family story. But I will say, to the question of telling a child, so much of this quest, so much of this book was hard to write and sad and disheartening, right? We're in a weird and tough place as it concerns identity and immigration in this country. But the hope that I had, and the thing that I came away with, was we can still shape our present. And in the present, I have this beautiful child, and I can tell him stories that are true. And I can try and make him a better person than I am, so that when he inherits the talking stick, when he gets to tell the story, he'll tell it even better and more fully and more truthfully than I will. And I think that's the hope that we all have, right? That we take our time, our however many rotations we have on planet Earth, and we use them to the fullest.
That was deep. That was really deep.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we're going to open the floor for questions. I have 2 requests of you. 1, that your question be a question. And 2, that I know everybody likes to think they have a nice loud voice and they can talk without the mic. You cannot. Use the mic.
Someone has to have a question. Thank
Yes.
you very much.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. I'm Jane Costin. How are you doing?
Hi, Jane.
So my question is, so you talked a lot about how the book and how your researching of the book changed how you perceived your family. How did it influence how you saw being mixed race? Because I know as someone who's mixed race, my parents very much were like, well, you know, with you, like, black, white, but you're both and you're neither. And I'm like,
Right.
oh, that's weird to be neither and nothing at all.
Right.
Like, how did that change? Because, you know, you have this, you are inherently this combination of two things.
Right.
You're not these two things. You're both and all at the same.
Yeah. So and I'm honest about this in the book. When I was growing up, I was surrounded by white people, and I grew up in a white part of DC, and I identified with I didn't identify with Garfield, but I was interested in Garfield and like Saved by the Bell and Chips Ahoy and Sebago. These are all talismans of white culture, right?
I like Garfield.
Yeah. Okay, Garfield we'll call Garfield a multiracial cat.
Yeah.
Not that the cat is, but that he can be enjoyed by a multiracial audience. And in the course of researching this book, I got more interested in my Burmese history, but and I think it's also a sort of consequence of writing this book in this environment under this administration. I began to see myself much more defined by being a person of color, and like much more actually interested in understanding the narrative of and the struggles of people of color and those who are marginalized generally in society. I mean, I don't know that you have to choose, for example, but because I had sort of, I think, fostered this one side of my cultural history for so long in such formative parts of my adolescence, that I have gravitated towards the other side as I've gotten older. And especially in this climate when voices of color and people of color are so marginalized, it felt important to me to give some more attention to that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Hi.
I'm Alexia McCammon. Nice to meet you. I have two quick questions.
Okay.
One is quick, one is I'm going to find the thought along the way. So the first is
Okay.
alternative titles for the book, ones that were fun and interesting or just weird that you decided against. And the other is thinking about how, you mentioned we are in a weird time of identity and immigration in this country. And the way that I think about it, and I think a lot of people realized after the 2016 election, was that some folks had a fear of the minority becoming the majority, right? Like people who look like us and who don't look like them. So in doing your research and writing this book, do you have a better understanding or a way of sort of where these fears are coming from, or specific things that people could actually be afraid of instead of just, oh, they don't look like me and maybe they're getting prioritized in terms of getting a job or getting to a certain school, if that makes sense.
Can we start with the book titles?
Yeah.
Let me start with the harder question first. Without going into a whole thesis on the Trump voter, I will say I think there are it's a confluence of factors. I think there is the demographic destiny of America, right? In theory, the Futureface. That is something that we've been talking about for a while. I think that there's fear of that. I think that there's hangover of fear of that from the Obama era, where it was like, wait a second, we have a mixed race president. What's happening here? And people wanting to, specifically white voters wanting to take that narrative back culturally and say, we are still the dominant, we define the American narrative. I think there's economic malaise. I think that there has been a lot of fear-mongering in certain parts of the media and online, suggesting that immigrants are the bane of our existence. But that's been happening. It happened in Burma too, right? Like, we find convenient scapegoats. They tend to have darker skin. They tend to be less economically empowered, and we use them, we pin all of our troubles on them. That's, I think, to some degree what's happening here. And we live in a wild, tumultuous, chaotic experiment. And sometimes anything can happen and does. And to some degree, that is what happened. But again, I go back to what I said at the beginning. I think this is the end of something, not the beginning of something, this moment. And alternate titles for the book included, they're so much worse than Futureface. The one I wanted was who we thought we were, because I thought that sounded really serious and epic. And then the book, our working title was Stories We Tell Ourselves. And then I think my editor had some other like fragment of a sentence. I can't remember what those are the only two that I can really think of. Futureface is better, isn't it?
It's good. Yeah, catchy. Shorter.
Thank you. Yeah, it's more better branding.
Thinky emoji.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for taking the time to share your story with us. It's really, really cool. I guess for if you were speaking to someone who was interested in sort of setting off on kind of like a similar journey, but maybe didn't have the time, resources, or skill to write a book about it, what is the advice, both practical and abstract, that you would give?
I think the most meaningful and the useful and the cheapest thing to do is to talk to your family. First of all, like the idea that we're all interested in our ancestors but don't actually call our aunts and uncles and cousins is like, come on. Like this is the whole point, right? We're supposed to be like, find out who your family is. Ask them stories. And then fact check those stories. But I mean by that, look at the history books. Like it had never occurred to me to sort of like, I knew my grandfather did this thing in Burma, but it never occurred to me to like Google that thing and then read a book about that thing. But that's actually how you find out your family history. So the personal and the immediate, and then the big picture. And it's really actually rewarding. Like the Suez Canal thing, I can't tell you enough. It was so cool to be like, wow, because that slice of land was opened up, my family history changed. I mean, that is like, it contextualizes everything. And you don't have to pay Ancestry.com a $25 a month fee to do it.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks, Alex. Oh, sorry, for talking about
You're
your
so
book.
welcome.
Yeah, looking forward to it. What is the one message that you'd like your reader to take away, or maybe there are different messages you'd like folks to take away from your book?
At the risk of beating a dead horse, I'll say, live right now. I mean, like I said, it's good to know, it's important to know that your history, and it's good to have those lessons in your quiver. But we're so fractured, we're so isolated. We don't call our neighbors anymore. We don't think of our friends as much. And as much as it's good to know about biographies and history, it is also imperative that we invest as heavily and as substantively and as emotionally in the life we live today. And that is like, I mean, it's something I try and actually, it's the thing that changed me in this book. You know, I actually feel like I tried to start living my life differently at the end of it. So that's what I would take away.
Yeah, thanks.
Hello, thank
Hi.
you. My family immigrated from Egypt, so we do care about, or I care about the Suez Canal, which is great.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
So
You were ahead of
fan
the
in
game.
the back. You got a fan in the back. So my question is buried under a little bit of this premise, which is, you know, immigration quotas were lifted in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And you saw, you know, from 1920 to 1960, there's essentially no immigration from North Africa, from the African continent, from South Asia, from East Asia, to what I understand. And this was lifted in the 60s, and then you saw this influx of, you know, my parents and other...
My parents,
your
or my
parents,
mom.
or your mom. And I think my generation, you know, the first generation here, being born here, we've learned to assimilate, and I think we've learned to appreciate how to express our own culture, but internalize that with a intrinsic American identity. It's not even up for debate. And I would say I'm optimistic looking forward that we're going to see now first generation, second generation start to emerge and really expressing a minority identity in a very positive way and kind of embracing American virtues and understanding that, you know, yeah, in Egypt, I mean, I'm from Alabama, and I love Alabama, by the way. When I go to Egypt, I get more discriminated being Egyptian in Egypt because, you know,
Yeah.
there's a kind of leaning towards the tourism there. So What is your, are you optimistic about that? Or
Am I optimistic about generations hence carving out an American identity?
Futureface, yeah, I mean, kind of.
I'm optimistic generally.
Amalgamation in this current time, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think, yes, I am. I mean, I'm inherently optimistic, and I feel like we are moving, however, incrementally slowly to a more equitable future, or one that is at least more inclusive of multiple narratives, right? I mean, look at the Confederate statues that we're pulling down, right? That's hard evidence of like, well, wait, the story we've been telling ourselves and the monuments we've been creating are like actually really exclusionary and fucked up for like a not insignificant part of our country. So, you know, I believe in that work, and I believe we are on that spectrum. To your point of going back home, you know, it is hard to be a child of immigrants and then to go back to the homeland. Yeah. This is why the whole like deportation thing and like sending dreamers home makes literally no sense. I went back to Burma and I was like there for however long. I was there for a long time, and I was like, get me out of here. Like it was important research, and it was good research, and it was nice to reconnect with some long lost family, but that's not my home.
Right.
This is my home. And that's what's real. And the longer, the more we can sort of invest in the fact that this is our home. We can bring the lessons and the histories of our parents, but like this is our place, the better, I think, the happier, the more honestly we'll be living here.
Great. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
So clearly you went to great lengths to really get to some core truths of your family history, but and with your reference to Confederate monuments, it seems that some of our fellow citizens are really digging into their family history to reinforce their own views and to believe things that may not be a core truth of their family history. They may have family members that did horrible things, but they'd like to believe that they're good people, and that Confederate monuments that have people that are similar to their ancestors were actually fighting for a just cause and not people that are on the wrong side of history.
Yeah.
So my question to you is there some danger in our culture with people not really getting to the root and being willing to accept the history that is right in front of them, and that the facts would seem to paint a different picture than they're willing to believe?
Yes. The answer to that is yes. I mean, when people are impervious to facts and history, it's really hard to make a logical argument, right? And I, you know, we run up against that, but that's where I kind of go back to, I mean, that's, if it's comfort, it's cold comfort. The story I learned in Burma, right? There is there is nationalism, there is violent nationalism there. It is not just unique to America. We will get through it. Countries do. It is unfortunate that we keep having to live through it in this country, and it's unfortunate that I think technology is abetting more delusional points of view and political ideologies. But again, I don't think it's the destiny. I think it's the moment.
Thanks.
We can do one more quick question.
Or maybe no more. Oh, one more.
Or two. One real question, one fake question.
Okay.
So since we're in D.C., growing up in D.C., going to Wilson, you touched on this a little bit. Guilty.
I know. I love your family. Go ahead.
You touched on this a little before. How did growing up here, you know, inform your take on all this? I mean, you know, you went to Wilson. That's whatever. So that's the real question. The not real question is, how did Lucas and Seth inform your joy at finding out you were part Jewish?
Yes. I have very good friends from high school, and many of them are in the audience and in the front rows, and I thank you guys all for coming, and brothers of my friends from high school, thank you. I think it was really great to grow up in Washington, D.C. Let me just give props to my hometown, which gets maligned as a place of just government bureaucrats and swamps, and I don't say drain the swamp, pump some more water into it. Let's make it bigger. I feel like I would not be the person that I am had I not grown up here. I grew up I joke, but everyone else went to the mall. We went to the mall, and we went and protested, and we knew what was going on in the world. And we may not have had cool we didn't have underage IDs and go to bars, but like we knew what was happening at the UN. Like we knew where the World Bank was. And that's part of being a woke citizen in the world. And it was great that was those patterns of, I think, engagement and protest were established so early. That's totally been foundational in making me the person that I am. So thank you, Chocolate City, for everything you've done for me. And thank you guys. And thank you, Vann.
Oh, no, thank you. So we're going to do a book signing,
Book
right?
signing.
This is Alex's very first
This is
book
it.
signing.
The first
So make it
time I've
special.
signed books. Thank you, Vann.
Well, thank you so much.